today we've realized that infighting is actually good. That in a democracy, we have to argue with each other. It's not perfect. In my alliance, the three parties don't get along on a lot of issues. We fight, and sometimes publicly, but that's part of it. I mean, look at the great Indian family, yeah? Which family doesn't fight amongst itself?
Yeah.
You're the argumentative Indian for a reason, and you can't expect your politics to be any different.
What's the energy on the ground in Maharashtra? What's happening during the campaign, and what are you witnessing? What can we know about?
And give us the non-spokesperson version.
100% sure. At risk of losing my job so quickly after
No,
I
please
have
do
got
not
onto it.
lose your job.
I'm not losing my job, don't worry.
That we've been speaking for a while, and we haven't once spoken about like your queer identity in politics. So I want to ask you, is that incidental? Like, I mean, do you really relate to yourself as a queer politician? Does that play out in your work, your queer identity? Or is it something that's more private and people don't really talk to you about it? Let's just talk about the intersection of your political journey and your queer identity.
So I think the precedent that I set then, which is one that I set after joining this party as well and even before, is that my queerness comes with me. And it's definitely not all that I talk about. It's not what I'm supposed to be talking about exclusively as national spokesperson. You know, most of the television interviews I've done are about the Badlapur incident of sexual assault, or about the Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj statue collapsing, or about the sort of state of the economy because of freebies being handed out. And so the range of work on a day-to-day is not related to queerness. But what I've also maintained is that queerness is not separate from my political identity.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Don't Run Into Glass, a podcast hosted by thecitizen.in. I'm Gayeti.
And I'm Anica.
And Anica, what are we chatting about today?
Today, I am really proud because I feel we have someone representing us, someone young, someone part of the larger spectrum of society who is a national spokesperson. We are speaking to Anish Gawande, the national spokesperson of NCP-SP, who is pretty much India's, and I want to say in the rest of the world, pretty much a great example for an openly queer person in politics. Hi, Anish.
Hello,
Welcome.
hello. Thank you so much for having me on the podcast. And
Congratulations.
Thank you. It's still new territory and new terrain.
When did this happen? When were you
exactly
appointed?
a month ago, 5th of August.
Okay, so we really got you at a very crucial time.
You're
a newly appointed spokesperson. Maharashtra elections are coming up in a couple of months as well. So it's quite a defining moment. I have to say that Anish, we've met a couple of times briefly socially, but I was very proud, even though I don't know you very well, when I saw the stories and like the headlines that Anish and they all came, and as they rightfully should have, with the tag that the NCP-SP has an openly gay political spokesperson. And I felt what a tide, there's almost like a shift in India in the last few months.
This year for India is a gift that just keeps giving. It just keeps giving. Since June, there's a transformation that has happened in this country. And then with you, I think it's a great milestone of political history in India, right?
It's been an exciting year so far. I think leading up to the Lok Sabha elections, I think there was a general fear of a repeat of what happened in 2014 and 2019. And I think what's been really reassuring is that we've got a reinvigorated opposition, we've got a clear mandate for change, and we've got the beginning of what I think is a new political imagination, right? And I think my being appointed as national spokesperson for the NCP-SP, the fact that I can be out and proud and have those headlines without my party batting an eyelid, the fact that today I'm engaging with politicians across party lines and getting the same amount of respect as I would if I were a straight man is a sign of the times changing. And the fact that we're really now finding and struggling to find in some ways what it means to get to India 2.0, right? That we have to put a sort of reset button on the mess that we've gotten ourselves into, both economically but also socially and ideologically. And that reset button is just being pressed now, and what comes after is being decided as we speak. So it's been an exciting time, not just for me, but I think for the Indian political sphere as a whole. And I think after
and the
June,
people of India, I mean, to represent a minority gives so much support and care to so many other minorities to feel like, we are being spoken about, we're being represented, somebody's standing up for us. So it's been fantastic in that way. But how does campaign look like? You're 2 months away from Maharashtra elections. Maharashtra, big state,
Yes.
And
huge player.
key election. Like, I think everyone has their eyes on what's going to happen.
This is a do or die election.
It's a do or die election.
I think
the
there's
pressure is
no
on.
election more important currently
Yeah.
to the future of our democracy, to the protection of our constitution, to the safeguarding of the values we like, right? I think for most people, Maharashtra's election is important because the second largest state. But for India today, Maharashtra's election is important because it comes after the dismembering of two political parties in a downright unconstitutional manner, right? You've seen a democratically elected government, the Mahavikas Aghadi, with Uddhav Thackeray as the chief minister, being sort of dismantled by a rug being pulled under the carpet of two of its constituent parties, my party, the NCP-SP, and the Shiv Sena UBT, where half the MLAs were just bought by the BJP and they formed an illegal government unconstitutionally. And that government is facing its first electoral test in November this year. And I think there's going to be a response that has to be given loud and clear that this politics just doesn't work anymore. You cannot betray the mandate of the people. And you cannot betray a government that has been put together by the people of this country. And so I think it's a litmus test. It's one that's going to sort of test the strength of our institutions, but also the willingness of our voters. And Maharashtra, by the way, voted overwhelmingly in favor of the MVA in the Lok Sabha elections. So after UP, the biggest chunk of sort of Lok Sabha seats that came to the India Alliance were from Maharashtra.
That's right.
31 Lok Sabha seats between the alliance. And my party won 8 out of the 10 seats we contested with a 80% strike rate, which was quite incredible and a testament to the fact that people were finally fed up of the government in power. But it was 31 versus 17, right? And I think if we see that repeating in the state elections, you're going to see a vote of confidence from a state that's always believed in progressive values for a progressive future for the country. So no pressure, but...
I was just going to say no pressure because it really sounds like a lot is riding on this election. Yeah. But let's talk a little bit about your work on the ground. Like, what is campaigning looking like? We're talking about a shift, right, in India since June, we're saying. And the shift is also, I think, interesting because there's no overt, like, single political party that has come and presented a challenge to the status quo. I think what we're seeing is fragments and smaller voices and sort of regional parties and smaller players now being able to assert themselves and realizing that smaller parts make a whole. I think that finally has happened in India.
It's a bit fantastic. It's like the Gadbandhan that finally worked. And also these smaller fragments are showing such a great example of kind of standing together and kind of working towards the nation together, even though they have their individual agenda points and their individual mandates. But somehow
and small things like the problems with Gadbandhans working often, and I've seen this while I was in the field, is that let's say you have Party A and Party B both choosing to, sort of contest. Well, Party A chooses is in alliance with Party B and is contesting one seat. But Party B is pissed off that seat wasn't given to them. So their workers are just sitting in the party office and are not actually rallying and campaigning on the ground. And for a long time, I think that was the reality in India, where you have alliances in theory that should work. But when you go in the field, you would see that, okay, Party B is annoyed that they didn't get the seats, so their workers are really not there, or the vote isn't translating.
It's like a decline of petty politics.
Lots of small things like that.
But I think that there's a reason for that, right?
Yeah.
I think so far you've seen a situation arise where, for better or for worse, alliances have been built with the purpose of getting back into power.
Yes.
And many critiques have been leveled against the India Alliance, and some of them are valid. But I think what I've seen on the ground, what I've seen over the course of the last few months, is that the alliance has truly come together in the pursuit of an idea.
Yes.
The idea of a country governed by a constitution that has certain rights enshrined within it.
And I think now you feel like that agenda is there, that vision is there.
That
of
vision is
what
there, which is why
unites-
this
yeah.
problem where party workers were not working for the other candidate is something that you don't see to the same extent. Of course, I mean, any alliance, you're going to see challenges. And a lot of the work that is happening on the ground is meeting a lot of party leaders, saying that, listen, there's only so many seats, there's 3 alliance partners, we can't give everyone a seat this time, but there are ways in which your voice will still be heard. But I think the pursuit of a larger idea is what brings this alliance together and what's made it work. And I think we're seeing a different sort of public imagination. You know, if you ask me 10 years ago, when I come from a fairly conservative family, my father used to be a Modi supporter until I changed his mind not
Oh,
too
you
long
changed
ago.
his mind?
That's my greatest achievement. I think changing my father's mind is my number one achievement.
Bless you.
And I think that change begins at home, right? I think more than ever before, we're witnessing that you don't have to go out and change the world. You have to change those who you can influence. And that's where even an alliance like this works, right? Every individual party has its constituents who they can talk to best and who will listen to them. And they're talking to those constituents and convincing them of this idea that the constitution is worth protecting. But 10 years ago, the idea was that you should give power to one man. He should take all the decisions. And that's how decisions will be taken for this country. And that's how this country will become a superpower. We witnessed the spectacular failure of that. This one man taking decision business needs to end because it doesn't work.
But that was the story that was sold, and a lot of people bought in. And you're right. I think people bought in because
And
it was a
still
good
buying it
story.
because
And why
at the end-
shouldn't they?
yeah.
You know,
Why
I
shouldn't
think
they?
it was a valid listen. The UPA 1 and 2 were, in my opinion, great governments, but it was a media spectacle. Every day you were waking up to one party fighting against the other, somebody saying something against someone else, a scam being unearthed, etc., etc.
There
So
were,
I think
we don't need to sugarcoat it. There were lots of problems
There
with
were a
the
lot
way
of
things
problems.
were with UPA 1 and 2, which is why people needed that sense of hope, which was coming in from a centralized form of power.
But I think what the beauty is that today we've realized that infighting is actually good. That in a democracy, we have to argue with each other. It's not perfect. In my alliance, the 3 parties don't get along on a lot of issues. We fight, and sometimes publicly, but that's part of it. I mean, look at the great Indian family, yeah? Which family doesn't fight amongst itself?
Yeah.
You're the argumentative Indian for a reason, and you can't expect your politics to be any different. Because that's the sort of safety valve that you have to ensure that no single party, no single individual can push an agenda that isn't being sort of stress tested. You know, in the corporate world, you're stress testing ideas. You've got a sort of team doing oppo research and doing work on whether it's a good idea or not. For the last 10 years in politics, you've just had no critique.
Yeah.
You're told that this is the policy, it's good for you, roll with it. This is the bridge that is going to be built, regardless of whether the public hospital next to it has been upgraded in the last decade or so or not. Right? So you've just been told this is good for you. We've decided, go ahead with it.
But nobody likes that kind of politics as well, because you just feel so sectioned out. Whether you agree or you disagree, and if you disagree, there's no one to really stand up for you. So I completely feel so motivated and so reassured when I see that there are different people going to stand up for different things. Even if they have to fight with each other, they are going to represent what is important to the community that they are standing up for, or the section of people that they're standing up for. But I do want to go back to what Gayeti just asked. What's the energy on the ground in Maharashtra? What's happening during the campaign, and what are you witnessing? What can we know about
And
it?
give us the non-spokesperson version.
100%. Chalo. At risk of losing my job so quickly after
No,
I
please
have
do
got
not
onto it.
lose your job.
I'm not losing my job, don't worry. To be fairly honest, I think most of us did not expect the results that we witnessed on the 4th of June, right? We did not expect so many MPs from the opposition to get elected.
Yeah.
And it was a really tough battle because, again, we'd lost our party's name. My party's name used to be the NCP.
I know.
We lost the name and we became NCP Sharad Chandra Pawar. We lost our symbol. They took the symbol away from the guy who started the party, Pawar Sahib, and gave it to the breakaway faction. And so the clock, which was our symbol for the longest time, was gone. And just a couple of months before the election, we were allotted a new symbol, the man blowing a sort of trumpet.
Yeah.
which you had to convince the voters of and inform the voters of before a general election. And this is not an urbane, upper class, upper caste voter. This is a sort of rural Maharashtra voter. But the magic was that managed to happen. The conversion sort of took place. Voters figured out what the symbol is. And there was a serious effort that took place that resulted in the result that you see today.
Yeah.
But after that result, I think the immediate response, and I'm incredibly grateful that I saw this response up close, and it's one that convinced me that this was the party to join, was not one of satisfaction. I know that 2 days after this election result, Supriya Tai and Pawar Sahib were campaigning again. They said, "Great job, well done.
Can't
Lok
stop.
Sabha's in the pocket, now Vidhan Sabha.
Can't
The
stop,
government
won't
in
stop.
Maharashtra has to change."
Yeah.
And so it's been that intense burst of energy. Pawar Sahib, Mr. Sharad Pawar, who's the head of the party, is 83 years old. And he's doing campaign rallies left, right, and center, addressing crowds of thousands of people, doing the sort of legwork that's needed to push the party ahead. And you've got the entire party leadership spread out in sort of 3 directions across the state, doing rallies, meeting workers, meeting alliance partners, and really hitting the ground running. So right now, I don't think I've ever seen an election where preparations have started this early and continued this vigorously. I was on, so the first political campaign that I was on after I was appointed national spokesperson was the Shiva Swarajya Yatra, which was taken out by our party state president Jayant Patil ji and the Shirur MP Amol Kolhe ji. And it was sort of reinvigorating the ideals of Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj and saying that a sort of just government needs to be restored to the state. And everywhere you went, the crowds were coming on their own. And these were sort of tiny rallies that were being held in Zunnar, which is on the outskirts of Pune, and were very back to the basics sort of rallies. We didn't have massive sort of stages or great AV systems. There were street plays being performed by this theatre troupe that was mimicking the government.
Nice.
There were these rallies taking place where you had one sort of old microphone system. I don't know if you've seen some of those old sort of
Yes.
photos of political rallies and campaigning that the event company's name is written over there, whichever local one it is. And it was really so amazing to see that people were turning up in huge numbers to just listen
Yeah.
to the vision that you have that is an alternative to the one that exists today.
Hmm.
So it's been full on.
I have 2 quick points. One is just a point so that I don't forget it, and the other is something I want to ask you. I mean, and I was telling Anica this as well, that I was a fairly political person. I had a very
She used to conduct interviews
clear
with political leaders.
I also had a clear political opinion, but I think over the years I've just sort of retreated very much into an apolitical shell and bubble.
Yeah.
And not because I even
As
support
did so many, Gayeti.
so many.
So
yes.
many people were deflated and they just lost interest in politics. They lost interest in the country.
And
Yeah.
I also want to preface that by I'm sometimes confused who to vote for, because it's not as if I support one political party over another. I was just sort of dejected at the fact that we didn't even seem to have an option.
Yeah.
And that it was more frustration stemming from that realization as opposed to really endorsing one or rejecting another political party. But I think the June results kind of gave us all hope in a way. So it kind of reinvigorated even my interest in politics. I'm not surprised that even the political players, instead of being okay, this was a victory for us, even the political players that are actually on the ground and political parties were actually reinvigorated by the results. And you can even see that in even the Congress or even the larger parties that you see at a more central level. You can see the fact that they're on the ground, they're campaigning, the party worker isn't looking thakawa and dead. Honestly, that was my one pet peeve with the Congress. The Congress party worker for a while just looked like they couldn't care less.
Yeah.
I mean, I have to say that openly. When I was on the ground, I've seen it. So,
And it was the case for a lot of parties.
for a lot of parties,
And I think that was the reality of the situation, that you had nothing to offer your karyakartas. You didn't
Yeah.
really have a silver lining on these clouds. You didn't have any light at the end of the tunnel. And there was a very, very long pause
Yeah.
where a lot of people, me included, I don't think I had much hope either. And I don't think I would have joined a political party if the 4th of June results hadn't played out the way they did.
Yeah. And I think the point we're making is that whichever political party is in power, democracy needs some kind of like
Hope.
opposition.
Yeah.
And that opposition doesn't necessarily have to come from one political party. It can come from a little, fragment of political parties like it has. But the point that I now want to make, which is the sort of separate from this, is that we've been speaking for a while and we haven't once spoken about like your queer identity in politics. So I want to ask you, is that incidental? Like, I mean, do you really relate to yourself as a queer politician? Does that play out in your work? Your queer identity, or is it something that's more private and people don't really talk to you about it? Let's just talk about the intersection of your political journey and your queer identity.
So, for the longest time, I thought those were very separate things.
Yeah.
And I'd kept them separate as well. My first campaign that I did was 2014 as a door-to-door volunteer for Milind Deora. And at the time, I was sort of very inspired by the fact that we had to rise up against the idea that the BJP was going to come to power and that the ideological fabric of this country was going to change forever. It was a very wise 17-year-old, I must say, that there was a certain feeling that this was something that needed to be countered. And at that time, I hadn't come out yet. I would go on to come out much later over the course of my time in the US and sort of abandon these plans of coming back into politics. I think when I came back to India in 2018, I was reassured by the fact that Milind at the time was very comfortable with me being out and proud and sort of working on the campaign. But even then, it was a very personal identity, right? I think over the course of that 2019 election, I was out in that if you knew me, you would know that I don't have a girlfriend or that I don't want a girlfriend. But if you asked me about whether that was something that I was campaigning for or whether I was an activist in some sense of the word, I would say no. I think what changed was over the course of that campaign, realizing that a lot of politicians were comfortable with the idea of at least talking about queerness. And that's when I started Pink List India, which was an archive of politicians supporting LGBTQ plus rights, which sort of threw me into the limelight because it went viral, right?
Yeah.
And then
I think that's how we all got to know.
Fantastic initiative.
And it was incredible because I think it was right at the sort of cusp of the elections. We managed to put out lists of candidates who were supporting LGBTQ plus rights. But it was also a moment in which, in the middle of an election campaign that I had been running where my queerness was a very personal identity, it became a very public identity. And I think I didn't realize how big it would become. I don't think I realized how defining a feature would become in the rest of my life. But once it happened, you have to roll with it.
Yeah.
So I think the precedent that I set then, which is one that I set after joining this party as well and even before, is that my queerness comes with me. And it's definitely not all that I talk about. It's not what I'm supposed to be talking about exclusively as national spokesperson. Most of the television interviews I've done are about the Badlapur incident of sexual assault or about the Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj statue collapsing or about the sort of state of the economy because of freebies being handed out. And so the range of work on a day-to-day is not related to the queerness. But what I've also maintained is that queerness is not separate from my political identity, which means that when the National Medical Commission issues guidelines that say that homosexuality is unnatural or the two-finger test should be used to check for sexual assault or that differently abled rights should not be included in the syllabus, I'm going to take a stance and roll with it. And I think I've been very grateful. The party has been very accepting. And I think I've never once had a situation where I've been messaged by the party leadership saying, tone it down, that's too queer. And I think that's remarkable. We've come a long way.
And
I'm actually quite surprised by that.
Actually, we are hearing more news of other parties telling their candidates to now tone down certain rhetoric.
I mean, those candidates need to be told to tone down rhetoric. Yeah, when they
I'm so
complete
glad that that's
electoral
actually
casualty.
happening because, but it's funny.
Can you tell me who you're talking about?
I'm talking about certain new candidates who've just gotten a ticket.
Talking about Kangana Ranaut, our very dear friend in the BJP, who we all love in the opposition, because every time a statement is made that side of the aisle, we gain a few votes more. So
Yes.
she's my favorite.
She's
politician.
helpful.
She's very helpful. She's my
very
favorite
helpful.
politician.
Yeah, but
Um,
it's funny because it's actually the first time that we're actually seeing that party tell someone to calm down.
yeah,
There's so many other factions that they can also
No,
tell to
no,
calm
they
down,
tell
but
people to calm down, but they wait for the backlash first, and then they're
and
like,
then they
okay,
tell
there's
people to calm
backlash, now
down.
calm down, calm down.
and when the backlash comes towards anyway, moving on from that, it's fantastic that nobody is coming and telling you to not stand up for who you're representing. It really gives so much hope in a country like India. Um, I kind of want to ask you something. What's happening in India right now, right? The elections, also big
Mm.
elections happening in America as well. Um, an openly queer politician becoming also the national spokesperson, and taking on a vocal camera facing role. Where else have we seen it in the world?
These are pivotal moments, and I think we're at a very, very unique moment in India today, because you're seeing, like I'd said earlier, the crafting of a new political imagination. That's an imagination that is inclusive of caste identities, of religious identities, of gender and sexuality, of differently abled identities, and it's an imagination that's struggling to find its voice. And this moment comes but rarely in a sort of country's history, right? And my other hat that I wear is that I'm a historian and trained as an intellectual historian, but I've kept my academic hat aside. But if you see the sort of trajectory of India's intellectual history, you see that a sort of Nehruvian socialism and a sort of Nehruvian politics was prevalent until the sort of 70s and the 80s. You've seen the growth of Hindu nationalism since then. And what we're witnessing today is, for the first time, a new sort of ideological movement that seeks to incorporate the diversity of this country in its change form today.
Yeah.
Right?
Are we
So
pinning too much on the June results? Like,
no, I don't think this is completely detached from the
Yeah?
June results, right? I
Okay,
think
go on, yeah.
regardless of the June results, I think we're at a very important moment where we're redefining what it means to be secular.
Yeah.
We're redefining what it means to be progressive.
Right.
We say that we believe in the Constitution, right? But the Constitution is a living document. It has to be sort of given new life every once in a while. So even the idea of queerness is alien to the Constitution when it's created, right? I don't think the
But
Constitution.
it was never alien to the culture of from the ancient period of India. I think you and I have discussed it, Gayeti. One quick fun fact: the country with the largest number of universities in the world is India. The country with the largest number of ancient universities in the world is
Also
India.
India.
So our intellectual history, yes, from the modern period has grown incredibly, but our intellectual history from the very ancient period has been one to revere, right? At the same time, queer identities played a role in society, significant role in royal households, right from the onset of early kingdoms. Essentially, the role of a transgender person that is the main communicator between the zanana and the male quarters was very, very important. And obviously, queer identities have been acknowledged in ancient history, but in India, it has been something that that was not. I don't want to say the word taboo, but it's a known fact.
100%.
It's not something new. So when you speak from an intellectual history perspective, I just sorry, I had to just jump in because I just feel
No,
so
100%.
passionate, because so proud of how far we've come, and how it's a resurgence. It's not something that's absolutely new that's happening in India. Identity politics has always played a very important role in how India votes, and most often
Too important.
too important.
Yeah, too
And one of the most important ways of even deciding who will get the ticket where, because of how caste politics has worked. But gender politics is coming in strongly, and you're seeing it in the parliament. But I'm just so excited that this intellectual tradition is not defeating us just yet.
Absolutely. But I think what's unique right now is, speaking of what's happening in the world and bringing upon a little bit of the conversation that we had earlier, is that you're witnessing a sort of queer inclusion and queer acceptance that takes a very different trajectory to the West, right? This isn't coming from a place of rebelling against the system. It's not coming from a sort of Harvey Milk era where you're standing up against the world. It's happening far more naturally and less, if I may say so, provocatively than that.
Yeah.
You
It's
know,
not
when I was appointed as
unnecessarily
national spokesperson, there
yeah.
wasn't, I mean, I don't think Supriya or Pawar Sahib ever asked me about my sexuality. Again, they don't care if I'm talking about my sexuality, which is great. But something that even Supriya Sule, who's the MP from Baramati and who's now the national working president of the party, said, which was truly quite incredible in an interview, was, I don't want to be seen as a woman politician. I'm a politician who's a woman, and I'm good at my job, but I'm just as good as all of the others. And so, of course, I'm going to talk about women's rights. I'm a woman politician. When sexual assault happens, I will be holding a protest. But you can't box me into that category. And I think that's the spirit that's come inside the party. And that's what's led to people across the party, right? Regardless of what identity they come from or what identity they hold, being given the freedom to do what they want. And it's quite exciting because, someone told me the other day, they were like, you're probably one of the few queer people on national television talking about non-queer issues. Because in a way, whenever queer people get called to talk about politics at the national stage or on mainstream television, it's usually when the 377 judgment has been passed or marriage equality is being discussed.
Or Pride Month.
Or Pride Month is around. And so then that's when you're discussing queerness, right? And that's when I've seen most queer people on television. And today, this role has been quite transformational in allowing me to speak my mind, but also be a queer person on TV and disrupt some of the myths of what people think queerness looks like,
And what they will talk about.
And what they'll talk
stand
about.
up for.
Exactly. And I think that's been quite an exciting process. And I think that's where I want to see a lot more of the work that I'm doing play into, that I think by just doing the work that I do, regardless of whether I do work on queerness or not, there's a certain way in which queerness is becoming part of the Indian political mainstream. And to be fair, right, there have been a lot of other people who've walked this path before me. So way back in the 1980s, you had a trans woman, Kamla Jan, who became a sort of corporator. You then had Shabnam Morsi in 2000 becoming an MLA. She's been the highest sort of queer person elected to public office in this country, in Madhya Pradesh. And this was long before other parts of the world could even dream of having trans representation in like the mainstream political sphere, right? And more recently, you've had politicians like Disha Pinky Sheikh, who's an NTD nomadic tribe trans woman, who's the spokesperson for the Vanchit Bahujan Aghadi. And you've had Madhu Kinnar, who's the mayor for Raigarh in Chhattisgarh. And you've really seen a way in which queerness has held its own across the country. And you're now seeing it sort of trickle down into other spheres of politics. So into other political parties, into other identities. I think sexuality has been something that's been a fair bit more taboo in terms of being out about your sexuality, also because in Indian politics, your private life is very private, regardless of whether you're straight or queer. And so you're seeing a sort of renewed interest in sexuality as well today, which I think will truly change the course of how we not only talk about sort of queer rights, but also about the rights of other minorities.
Correct.
Because suddenly you're seeing a thrust and a push where queerness, because it's associated with Bollywood, because it's associated with affluence, because it's associated with a certain level of respectability and social and cultural capital, has been able to carve out a space for itself in the political arena that other sort of minoritized identities have not been able to, right? So the fight for disability rights has not been able to carve out a similar space and gain as much prominence. Yeah. And I think what I would like to see is this sort of queer model of inclusion become one that is used to ensure that other sort of marginalized identities also gain a sort of way to enter the political mainstream.
Yeah.
Because for so long, you've just been told that if you don't sort of come from a political family or you don't have clout in a certain region, then politics is not for you.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're always told that.
Yeah.
Again, two observations. One is that, I always feel that India, being like a land of so many multiple complexities and layered identities. We've never had like that stereotypical, this is my identity badge, right?
Yeah.
Like I remember NAS Foundation, I think they'd done a survey in these villages in India where they'd surveyed men who have sex with men, and a large percentage admitted to having, even if they were married, identifying as men who have sex with men. But when they asked them, do you identify as gay? Most of them didn't. Because, we also have to understand that a lot of this terminology is Victorian and colonial. So you can have overlapping identities that are part of our culture. But the moment you put that identity on it, that's the taboo. But the practice itself, or the, sort of like,
and the fluidity
the
of that
fluidity of that identity is maybe even already
Yeah. People
part
also
of life.
want, people are desperate to box people into a certain category, little realizing that
through a very
identities can be-
Orientalist perspective, maybe.
maybe
I don't
yeah.
know.
But like identities are becoming so fluid now that it's also it's difficult for the person who's asking the question to kind of accept a complex or a fluid answer, flexible answer like that. But
Yeah.
what is it? Can you tell me clearly so that I can understand?
But I wanted to ask you, Anish, do you think your queer identity has sort of enabled you to sympathize or empathize with other minorities, which is important, let's say, in politics, because you speak of disability rights, you speak of other minorities that are sort of part of your political framework. How has your queer identity sort of played out via the larger minority politics in the country?
I think I've been put into a very tricky situation after this appointment, because for the longest time, I've always believed that representation is irrelevant.
Yeah.
Right? That I've always been somebody who's believed that representation can only go so far. And to truly get change happening on the ground, you have to change the nature of political discourse, not just have queer people at the table or women at the table, etc., etc. So you can only go so far. Of course, you should have women at the table, you should have queer people at the table. But if your fight ends there, then that's a bit of a problem. What I think has been really useful to sort of understand through queerness is exactly this sort of process of minoritization, and to understand the sort of ways in which discrimination can be a sort of visceral reality for so many people. And I come from a fair amount of privilege, right? Listen, I'm coming from a sort of caste privilege and class privilege family. I grew up in a city. I studied abroad. I was at Oxford and then at Columbia, lived abroad for a long time, came out in Paris, yada, yada, yada.
Yeah.
So I'm not claiming that me becoming a spokesperson for a political party is in any way representative of the queer community at large, or a big victory for all queer people simply by virtue of the fact that I am there. What I think is important, though, is that my being there has allowed for, both in my own sort of politics, but beyond that as well, a lens of inclusion to be applied to other minorities. And I think is really important today, because as a queer person, I have to acknowledge that queer people are not just queer. They're queer and Dalit, they're queer and Adivasi, they're queer and differently abled. And if I claim to stand up for the rights of queer people, I can't not stand up for the rights of other minorities as well, by default, because queer people are also those other minorities. Right? That queerness is this strange sort of identity that transcends other identities. It exists alongside other identities.
Correct.
And so the biggest realization in many ways has been that, hey, queerness might not be the dominant identity for a lot of people, because their dominant political identity is the one that's most under threat.
Yes.
So for queer Muslims today, their sort of queerness is important, but the identity that's under attack is their faith and their religion. And so in many ways, you have to navigate and negotiate that and say that, one, if you want to be truly committed to fighting for sort of queer inclusion, you have to fight for these other causes as well, because otherwise you're a hypocrite. And that places an incredibly difficult challenge, because immediately then you realize that these are very tricky situations to navigate, because often the rights of various minorities are at odds with one another. And I think that's where the political process is struggling today across the aisle. I don't want to blame the BJP either too much. I know I'm fairly against them, and I think we need to vote them out of power. But I think there's a struggle there as well, where you recognize that this is a country of incredible diversity, and to keep everyone happy is difficult, and to provide justice to everyone is also difficult.
Yeah.
And the framework in which that justice is provided, I think queerness has made that an ethical and moral imperative for me, which means then you have to find a practical solution. And that's been really useful. I think, today, I engage with people who you would think are the most sort of homophobic people on this planet. Indian politics is the most regressive space, right? It's not progressive. I mean, this is not like queer utopia, let alone utopia for any minority.
It's such an ironic fact of life, right? The politicians stand there to represent us, but we openly know that it is one of the most regressive fields.
Because we are still a fairly regressive society.
Yeah, well, listen, this is a reflection of who we are, right? Like, you get the leaders you deserve.
You do. You really do. I believe that to a degree.
And we've gotten great leaders who we deserve now because we got 31 seats in Maharashtra. But, so you're right. But I think the change comes but slowly. And, I have this funny story that I've told fairly often also before, of being on the campaign trail when I was just back from New York and was working with the Maharashtra Congress. We were part of this large Janasangharsh Yatra going across the state. And I was out then and sort of helping with the press office. And initially, over the course of this 4-month yatra, I heard a few sniggers behind my back being like, oh, he's like that, etc., etc. And then towards the end of this yatra, a very senior politician who was one of the ones sniggering just came out to me quietly and said, "Who's your tailor?" And that was so cute because, over the course of 4 months, you'd sort of chipped away at that block of homophobia and said that, listen, like, we can work around this and we can sort of have a genuine conversation about it.
Yeah.
And I think that's been really important as a queer person in politics as well. I think the minute you become a politician, you stop being an activist.
Yeah.
And you have to realize that very early on. So one, I have to be open to critique and criticism because I'm not going to be able to deliver what people want all the time. And sometimes I'm going to have to do things mandated by my party that I might not believe in or that I might not stand for. I can argue against those internally.
But not publicly.
Not publicly.
Yeah.
And I will try my best to ensure the party also sides by me on those decisions. But those decisions are not mine alone. But it also means that you realize that change is slow. And you have to commit to that slow change.
Yeah. And I guess also there was value in how you began this. You said that, you convinced your dad.
Yeah.
And it is that one person that adds up. And I think we've seen that play out recently. We've seen the power of like small incremental changes,
Now, I want to ask a question related to exactly this point, Gayeti. Before the election results had come out, I bumped into a Reuters reporter. And that person was covering the elections in Pakistan and was also covering the elections in India. And I asked that person, so how was it over there and how is it over here when you're covering? And this person was not South Asian. They were very visibly not South Asian. So I said, how was it? They said this thing to me. They were like, in Pakistan, when you went with a camera and you wanted to ask the people on the streets a question, they would come out and be very openly critical or favorable and basically just open with their thoughts. But when we came to India to cover the election, nobody wanted to talk openly. They were talking in very hushed tones. So my question right now that you are on the ground campaigning for the Maharashtra elections, has that changed?
Absolutely. The incredible thing is that has made such a difference. The 4th of June results have made such a difference. It's very sad that this was the reality not too long ago in India because we've not been that country. We've never been afraid to voice our opinion. We've never been afraid to hurl abuses at our politicians, let alone just critique.
Yeah.
I remember I came out onto the streets after Nirbhaya under the UPA government and criticized the government openly. When the India Against Corruption movement began, a lot of us were on the streets with Anna Hazare saying that corruption is not okay, standing up against the government. And over the course of 10 years, we witnessed a systematic stifling of our democratic voice, which is shameful.
Yes.
And that's something that was beautiful because, despite the fact that people were not publicly opposing the government and they were not even speaking out against the government, the election results played out the way they did.
They
And
just
this
didn't
is
want to
despite,
speak.
but this is so funny because that's why all the exit polls, I don't know if you saw the exit polls
They
for
were
this
wrong.
election.
wrong. Yeah.
They were wrong by a margin that is unbelievable.
Yeah.
They were all giving the BJP 350, 370. Some of the more excitable ones were touching 400
400,
and saying up ki bar 400 par in reality.
But listen, these numbers had proved to be correct the previous two elections.
Exactly.
So you kind of like, oh, I wrote off the elections when that happened.
Yeah.
I was like, oh, okay, again.
But what
we're
does
seeing
that speak about? This is the follow-up question that I wanted to ask. What does that speak about what's happening in the media industry right now? Is there a transformation that we're seeing?
No.
I want to say one thing because both of us went to Oxford. In 2000,
All three of us.
all
went to
three of
Oxford.
us,
three of
yes,
us.
yes. St.
Reunion.
Anthony, St. Cross, and
Brasenose.
hey. So 2014, general elections were happening, and there was a panel at St. Anthony's where on the panel was Manish Tiwari and Arnab Goswami.
Who's now been removed from St. Anthony's
Oh,
through a
yeah.
petition.
Correct.
was-
So he was there on the panel, and Faisal Devji was moderating that panel. Obviously, when question and answer round started, all the questions, I was really upset with the quality of questions because everyone was going, oh, India wants to know, why do you shout so much? Those typical questions. But I was really, really troubled, and I was studying classical Indian religions, and my Brahmanism professor came up to me, and we used to discuss politics all the time. I could never hear him. He used to talk so softly, but we used to discuss politics all the time. And both of us had decided to ask this question. I went up to Arnab Goswami and I said, there is a very strange coincidence that is happening. There is a wave that one is noticing in the politics of India with the upcoming elections, but there is a huge shift and move around of some of the biggest anchors and news channels that is also happening, you included. Is that a mere coincidence, or is there a certain amount of reorganization happening? That was the first time I watched Arnab Goswami fumble for an answer. He's like, I don't know, my reason to leave Times Now. He was in Times Now at that time. No. What was he in? Yes, he was in Times Now at that time. My reason to leave Times Now is very personal, and he had not yet announced Republic TV at that particular point in time. So, and I'm still trying to figure out what am I going to do next. So that happened in the media that time. And what I was suspecting was in fact right, the entire reshuffle in the media to become a spokesperson for the new politics of India was happening. Now, is there something happening? Are people getting more voices? Because I am also looking at, obviously we have the stifling of the independent media that is coming up on YouTube through people's personal voices that is happening because they're putting some regulations on people who are disseminating the news via YouTube. That's happening. But there is also, I'm also seeing the softening of those hard voices that were very pro ruling party now giving criticism as well. But I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that.
I was terrified when I was I was sort of appointed as national spokesperson because I said,
anyone would be.
You're facing the hyenas. Like, what are you going to do? There's no news anchor who supports my party. They're all sort of supporting the government. But over the last month, I think there's been a palpable shift in the way media channels, particularly traditional media, covers politics. Is there still a bias? 100%. Are you still told you can print something and not print something, show something and not show something? Absolutely. Are journalists still afraid to put out their opinion? 100%. Talk to any journal on the ground. But when an opposition leader speaks, they will carry his bite. The opposing side will at least be presented now. They might not narrativize it. They might not support it. They might not give it too much prominence. But if an allegation is made or if a critique is raised, the voice of the opposition is now heard on television.
There's breathing space.
There's breathing space.
And that's the real change.
But the government is terrified. The government is currently terrified because they don't know how to control this.
Yeah.
They can control.
But they're trying to, right?
They're trying to. So the broadcasting bill, they're trying to, but they don't. I mean, this is where this government doesn't know policy, right? This is where it's so funny when you see some of the rules brought in by this government because you think you can control the internet. This is not like your handful of cronies running media channels. This is the World Wide Web. No government has been able to do it. No government, unless you put a sort of China-like firewall, can control
But
public
I
opinion.
just want to say one thing on this point. This is not just the modus operandus of this particular government. All governments have tried to control the media. If we think that the UPA didn't do it, like I have enough stories from enough journalists
Absolutely.
that they got a phone call after a report was written being like, our editor said that you can't publish that.
Yeah.
So I think that has been like the press is something that the governments in power try to
But not to
control.
this extent.
Absolutely. I think this is just we're seeing a very extreme version of sort of principles of control that are anyway objectionable. So I think we are seeing that, but now we've gotten some breathing space. It's also where the money comes from, right?
Absolutely.
Like who owns the media?
But I think the great part is, and I say this as someone who is truly worried, even as a member of the opposition, about the sort of frameworks that have been laid in place by this government and the sort of systematic dismantling of institutions that has happened over the last 10 years, that the growth of independent media and the growth of platforms that can put their voice out with much lower budgets than ever before is something that is incredibly important and healthy for the democracy.
Absolutely.
Because now no government that comes even after them can control these voices.
Yes.
And because otherwise, I can guarantee you that any government that comes after would want to do the same.
Yes,
Because
exactly.
the precedent has been
The
set.
precedent has been set, and all governments want to control the media. And you're right. You see pockets of hope in independent media, but I mean, so the Citizen is an independent publication, and I'm again somebody who's been quite dejected because we started in 2014, and over 10 years, I've like I have 2 kids now. When we started in 2014, I didn't have kids.
Yeah.
Now I'm like, just my bubble is important to protect. I don't want to anger anybody. So you know what I mean? And that fear has crept in the media. You recognize that, of course, it's not only this government that's to blame. It's all governments that have been there in the past as well. But the good thing is, guys, honestly, that there are enough people like Anish and like others in our country who have the resolve to sort of push through. So even if there are few of us that sort of like, retreat, there are more people that are like coming forth. And I think that's important in a democracy. If everyone retreats, which is what it was seeming like till a year ago, then you're in a really, really troublesome space.
Yeah.
But as long as there are people sort of like coming forth, no matter who's in power tomorrow, this is not like specific to any party. Again, I'm just protecting my bubble here, guys. But
no, fair enough.
yeah.
As a mother of very young children, that's I see your personal sort of pain point over here. Like, I can't take those many risks anymore.
You can't, but that's a
right?
really difficult space to be in because you believe when you enter this space that the media should be fair and free and it's the 4th pillar of
well,
democracy.
in an ideal world.
And then realization sets in. But Anica, I also wanted to point to what you said about the Indian voter not speaking much. So I as a journalist, I have covered elections and been on the campaign trail. And there's one tip that my editor gave me, I should give that to everyone, is that if you're offered a cup of tea, never say no. Because over that cup of tea, you're going to break ice. You're going to, instead of getting 1 minute with the person, you get 10 minutes with the person. And they will give you like, it'll start like the conversation will flow.
Yeah.
So whether you're in a village like following the vote or you're like in a board meeting with like a politician or whatever it might be, that cup of tea is actually quite pivotal to getting the true story.
Yeah, cup of tea at the center of most important conversations,
Number
right?
of cups of tea I've had.
Hey
is-
man,
is
I just hope you're
just-
not lactose intolerant.
I am lactose intolerant. my constant supply of lactate keeps coming in from around the world
Next
from time
thing you
to
know,
time.
you're rolling up to the party office in an Uber with lactate.
With lactate. It's truly...
Lactose-free milk.
And you know,
Isse
it was
mera chai
fine.
banaiye.
No, lactose-free milk there's no normal milk in the house. But in Maharashtra, it was fine because chalo, one lactate pill is fine for a cup of tea. When I went to campaign in Haryana,
Yeah, you can't.
Man, the tea is made. I have a story to share with you about Haryana. I went on field. So it's probably the same thing. I went with a highly lactose intolerant person to do a field survey for the Gazetteer of Karnal, right? So, and I'm recording all the historic monuments of Karnal. And I am in this place, which is an old zanana of one of the Mughal kings over there. And it has now been made into a tabela. Tabela means
Yeah,
cowshed.
yeah.
Buffaloes are, so they see me and they see me with camera taking notes and everything. And this lactose intolerant person, they're like, chai piyoge? And they gave him chai. And he kept saying, नहीं मैं दूध वाली चाय नहीं पी सकता. He said, दूध वाली चाय नहीं पी सकता? क्या प्रॉब्लम हो रही है तन्ने? And he's like, नहीं मेरे को दूध से एलर्जी है. He said, दूध से एलर्जी है? He was most foxed. And I told, so I am, I come from that community of Jats. So I said, just take the tea and don't drink it. You
Yeah.
don't need to go into this explanation. That person came and slapped him on the back. He's like, दूध नहीं पिएगा तो ताकत कैसे आएगी? बच्चे कैसे बनाएगा? It was so funny. I'm sure you faced
you
the
can't
same.
say no.
You know,
You
it's
can't
a
say
very
no to
similar
tea.
story because I was again in Haryana campaigning, and we're in the sort of rural hinterlands of Hisar, and I am
Yes.
meeting Khap Panchayat leaders at this point because you have to meet them on the campaign trail, and sitting on a cart in the sort of courtyard of the house.
नीम के पेड़ के नीचे.
हाँ, और
Correct.
वहाँ पे
Hookah.
4 गाय, चाय भैंस है. The hookah came later, but at this point, they're like, दूध पियोगे? And you can't say no.
You can't say no. That's the problem.
So there were 3 of us, and the reluctant nod came about, and there you were, just
oh
getting
my God. You
milk
drank it?
straight from the source and a very large glass, and
Non-pasteurized right from the nipple.
Yep.
They
That was
probably
that.
pointed at him like a muh khol.
That was it, and I was like, Jesus Christ, our Father who art in heaven.
Oh
hallowed
my
be
God,
thy
the things
name,
you
and
have to do
bus.
to be a politician.
Man, in Haryana and Punjab, to say no to milk
You can't say no.
is like saying
you
no to
can't
a
say
cup
no.
of
It's
tea.
it's rude, guys.
You know,
I get
it's
it. I get it.
extremely
You
rude.
can't say
Yeah.
no. So
They'll
you sort
slap
of
you
learn
with
on
their
the job. You
makhan.
sort of you figure out how to do all of these
Also,
things.
it gives
and
you like brownie points, right? Like
it gives you massive
yeah,
brownie
yeah.
points.
You don't want to be that politician that said no to the milk.
100 and to give them credit, I think they really love when you try.
Yeah.
Because after the hookah came out, I was like, okay, this I can manage. I was like, okay. Except it's not green apple flavored hookah.
Excuse
It's-
me, there is gobar inside.
Yeah, and it's like the most
Guys.
intense tobacco filled hookah, and I take
Absolutely.
one puff and I start coughing. Like
And if
there's
it
no
doesn't
tomorrow.
gurgle, they get upset. They're like, "ठीक से खींच."
They realized that this
I
was
hope
not
they
gonna be able
voted
to
for
do.
whichever party you were
I
campaigning
really
for.
hope so. They did too. But
That it was not all in vain.
Yeah.
But okay, to end, I think this has been a great conversation. I just want to end with one question or observation. I think it's really important that people across the country have like role models like you to look up to. Because I feel like that's where change stems from. You want to see somebody sort of pave, and even though you come from a place of privilege, sometimes you need that privilege to be able to be amongst the few that have tread that path for more people to follow. Do you feel that the work that you're doing is pivotal in that way?
I think there's a sort of realization that with great privilege comes great responsibility, right? And I think that's been the biggest lesson over the course of the sort of 10 years that I've been in politics. It is that how do you mobilize this privilege for good, right? The fact that I come with this privilege means that I am less threatened by the state than a lot of others are. I am less likely to be silenced by the government or face serious consequences for speaking out than a lot of others who can be more easily silenced are. And it's been really, really powerful to see that in this new role. And I think I'm still finding ways to ensure that I can use that privilege for good. But an example of where that's been possible is recently when an old man was beaten up on suspicions of carrying beef in a train in Mumbai. And I could speak up about it. I could send it to journals. And then one of our party leaders, Jitendra Avhad, who's an MLA, went to the police station and ensured that the sort of offenses that were registered, which were bailable, were converted to non-bailable offenses, and those who were perpetrating that crime were brought to justice, right? And I think that's one of those spaces where you realize that the position that you're in, the fact that you come from privilege, the fact that you're also queer, and therefore have access to certain levels of social, cultural, and economic capital that a lot of others might not have, gives you the responsibility to become a sort of voice for others. And I think that's where that role model situation becomes one that doesn't just extend to queer people. And that's where it becomes more important than ever before to reinforce this idea that standing up for queer rights means standing up for the rights of everybody, means believing in queerness not as an identity but as a politics. It means a sort of belief in liberation that is spread across identities and is liberation for all. And I think that's a tricky terrain that I'm treading. I don't know how successful I will be at it.
Well, more power to you.
Yeah.
I think it's refreshing for us to see people like you in politics. I mean, it gives us hope. I think
It's a
I hope
powerful
I'm not
moment for
speaking
India.
from my own privilege to see, like, you know what I mean. I
Yeah.
feel like let's see people like you make a change in India, and I hope 10 years from now you're still in politics and making that change. And
Fingers crossed.
fingers crossed. That'll be the true test
Yeah.
of it, right? So
We'll
I
meet
think
10 years from now.
10 years from now.
Man, you've got a long way to go. And I mean, just with the Maharashtra elections, just all the best.
All of you watching in
the-
Maharashtra, please
the
vote.
The very, very best. Tell them your sign. It's been changed, right?
Our sign is man blowing a trumpet. Tutari vazanara manus. You'll see the trumpet being blown at every single event of ours. If you come to a party at my house in the coming months, you will also see a trumpet being blown there, because one must commit to one's politics in the private and the public life. And so, as the elections come around, vote for the Mahavikas Aghadi, which is the Shiv Sena Uddhav Sahib Thackeray, the Congress, and the NCP Sharad Chandra Pawar, and ensure that we get a new government in Maharashtra and a little bit of a glimmer of hope for the country.
Yeah.
Let's have a glass of milk.
Let's have a
to that.
glass
Have a
of milk
glass
to
of milk
wish it.
to wish it. Where's my latte?
Pop
Thank
that
you so much.
first.
This has been so much fun.
It
Thanks
has.
for
Thank
coming,
you for
Anish.
coming.
Very
Um,
exciting.
I mean, we really managed to catch you. Just all the stars aligned. And
All the stars have aligned.
Yeah.
Honestly,
happened.
yeah, they really did. It was not happening, and then it suddenly happened,
Suddenly
and I was
happened.
just like, "Whee." But you know, this conversation was long due, and it's really an honor to speak to someone who is standing up for something so important. Thank you so much for doing the work you do.
Thank you very, very much to both of you.
Thank you. And cut.